Welcome to Apologetics 101. I am your host, Christian apologist Brian Keith Bowen. This is the channel where you will learn the facts that the critics don't want you to know. And I want you to know these facts. I want you to learn them. Today, we're doing part 2 of the debate review video series that I've been doing on the debate between Dr. Jonathan McLatchie and Matt Dillahunty. Again, full disclosure, I have permission to do this debate review by James Coons, who is the host of Modern Day Debate. This debate's occurred on his channel. He's given me permission to do this debate review, and as well as open the door for me to be able to do debate reviews in the future as well on other debates. Of course, James has his channel discusses lots of different topic matters that are way beyond the scope of what my channel is about, but he does do debates on a lot of different religious matters that would be within the scope of my channel, and I of course like doing debate reviews. And this is a debate review, part 2 actually, on the response of Matt Dillahunty to Jonathan's case. Now, once again, I'm skipping over Jonathan's rebuttal because, like I said, largely me and Jonathan are pretty much in agreement on a lot of stuff that he was arguing, at least in this debate. And we differ on some trivial issues, and he's a theistic evolutionist, of course. I don't believe in theory of evolution, but this is not an issue that has come up in this debate or anything like that. A lot of the differences are trivial. There's some methodological differences, and that might come out as we're discussing this. But by and large, for the most part, I actually agree with Jonathan. So I didn't see any necessary to go over what Jonathan has presented in his opening case and rebuttal. We will get to some of Jonathan's arguments, though, when we get to the crossfire section and Q&A, because there's just no way I can do that specifically other than just to skip around scenes somehow. So I'm probably going to include some of the arguments that Jonathan is making in the process. But either way, there is a point that Matt made in the last when his open case and in the last video that I did, and I had missed it the first time. I didn't realize that he made this. He claimed that somehow he said Jesus was supposed to come back and defend all this, but he failed to do so, something to that degree. First of all, Jesus didn't fail to come back. He never gave a specific time when he was going to come back. The fact that he hasn't come back yet doesn't mean he won't. And the fact that he hasn't come back already doesn't mean he fell. Even if people expect him to come back, I think the early church grew a view, no one knows why they grew it, but they thought that Jesus was supposed to come back shortly afterwards, but Jesus never said he was. So this is not a failure on his part. Plus, Jesus doesn't need to come back and defend these things for them to be true or to be defensible. So I just wanted to point that out because I think I just kind of missed that part, on the last video. I might not have, but I think I might have missed that. So I just wanted to point that out in my opening presentation of this video. This video, of course, is going to be on the rebuttal session, more specifically Matt's rebuttal session, because that's what we're going to be reviewing. And in this I saw a number of fallacies he made, number of logical fallacies, and we'll get to those in a little bit. But I just want you to know that we're going to jump right into this. Hopefully this video won't be too long. I think the last one might have been a little over an hour. And let's get right to it. Thank you. Okay, I'm back. All right. I got my notes here. I'm a little bit more organized than I was last time. Last time, originally when I first did this debate review, I did the whole debate, and it was too long for YouTube, and I didn't save it. I should have saved it, and so I went through all kinds of technical difficulties, and I knew I would end up having to redo it. So when I did the first opening case, I just kind of decided to wing it because when I did it originally, I had all kinds of notes made up. I had 2 notebooks worth of notes. But I decided just to kind of wing it then. Um, I pretty much have seen this debate hundreds of times. But I decided to do I decided to this time around I would use notes because it would make me a little bit better organized and it wouldn't have me all over the place, hopefully. But anyway, again, we're doing Matt's opening case, or not opening case, but it's a rebuttal. And let's dive right in.
Now I'm betting you can hear me.
You bet.
Yeah. Sorry. So yeah, Jonathan in his opening statement basically set up 4 answers: myth, hallucination, conspiracy, or real, which is a version of liar, lunatic, and lawyer. When I say that he omitted legend, I said that on purpose, even though I did in fact recognize and remember that he included myth there, because when he talked about the myth option, what he said, and unless I heard it wrong, is that Jesus's followers didn't claim that he rose from the dead, and they would have been surprised, or as surprised as anyone else, to hear that this was the case, which baffles me a little bit, since you would think that, given various accounts of what was said beforehand, I don't know why they would be surprised that the guy who told them essentially that I'm God, I'm going to rise again type of thing. I realize some of them were going to be a little bit surprised, maybe, but to just write it off as that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about legend. I'm saying, see, Jonathan's working within the context of, hey, here are these elements reported in the stories, how I make the most sense within the context of the story if I begin with the assumption these events happen. I don't think that that's actually justified. I think that the events are not actually warranted for belief and acceptance based on the evidence available.
Okay. Let's start on. I would have allowed it to continue a little bit longer than. So I've actually got like at least two points that I wanted to make here. First of all, concerning the misunderstanding, he basically misunderstood what Jonathan was arguing. Jonathan was arguing the legend. When he said that the apostles would be surprised as anyone else, what he really means is that the event didn't happen and the event got made up as time went on. That's what he means by legend. Matt says he doesn't mean that by legend, but essentially he is. Because he probably takes a similar position to Matt or John or Barman, thinking things can be made up right off the bat and circulate that way. So he either says that or he argues, over time it gets fabricated or over embellished or something of that nature. But that is what. So basically, Jonathan is recounting the myth option. He just worded a certain way that made Matt, or didn't make Matt, but it directed Matt in a way that would cause him to misunderstand what Jonathan was actually arguing. And I'm not saying Jonathan did that on purpose. He wasn't trying to create confusion or anything like that. But Matt ended up getting confused just the same and thinking that he's talking about something different other than the actual understanding of legendary development. Now, of course, when historians use legendary development, they use it a lot different than a lot of skeptics do. Skeptics treat it like if it's not written down today, it's going to be legend tomorrow. but that's not how historians view legends. They view it as something that happens over time. As time goes on, things can start getting embellished and grow. You know, like someone's fish story. You know, 1 minute the fish was about this big, next minute it's this big, and then next minute it's a whale. Some of that nature. They mean that over time it grows and gets embellished and that sort of thing. And that, so when historians speak of a legendary realm, it's quite different than the way skeptics do. So part of that is because of how skeptics are understanding legend versus how historians understand it. So Matt could be right a little bit on that end because of how he, not that he's right about what he's saying, but whether he's right about, or right, that he's right that there is obviously a distinction or difference in how historians are understanding legend versus, say, a skeptic like Matt is saying when he talks about legend. But in any given case, clearly Jonathan wasn't trying to do a false trilemma or claiming that that liar, lunatic, and Lord and that sort of thing. That wasn't what he was trying to do. That was what he was trying to do. False trilemma is like the false dilemma. It's just where you just assume there's only 3 choices when there's a possibility of 4 choices. But he actually presented 4 options. So he wasn't trying to do a false trilemma to begin with. Neither did he do that. What about the second point? He says that he doesn't know why the disciples would be surprised. Why would they be surprised? Because he told them he was going to do it. Well, yeah, he did. But here's the thing. In that day, the Jews had no recollection of a Messiah that would die the death of a criminal than to be able to conquer Israel's enemies, because they thought that the Messiah was going to come and conquer that's what they were expecting from the Messiah, that they were going to conquer their enemies. At the time of Jesus' birth, that would have been the Roman Empire. That's what they thought. They also thought that that nobody would rise again from the dead before the general resurrection in the world. This is referenced in numerous sources, and it's referenced by N.T. Wright in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which he goes through all these sources on the resurrection. And this was their position. This is what they thought. They didn't think anybody would rise again before the general resurrection. If you look at the resurrection prophecies that are mentioned by Jesus in the New Testament, in the Gospels, the disciples either don't believe him or don't understand what he's talking about. And so, yeah, they would be pretty surprised. Now, is Jonathan talking about that when he says that they would be surprised? No. What he's saying when he says that they would be surprised, he means that the event didn't happen at all, and that the event got made up at some point. That's what he means when he says that. He's not saying that someone came up to him and said, Jesus rose again from the dead. And the disciples like, I don't know about anything about that, that sort of thing. In any case, let's move on. We're at a pretty good start, I guess. Decent. It gets more into it the more further we go into the rebuttal. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So let's go.
Against a lot of things that weren't part of my response. Why would they martyr? That's irrelevant. There are martyrs for countless religions that we both reject.
All right. I've got a second point here on martyrdom, so I'm gonna let him finish that thought.
I'm fine with the notion that people sincerely believed and were wrong. That what we see with alien abductions, with coronavirus conspiracies, with flat earthers, with pretty much every religion that both of us would reject, are a bunch of people who sincerely believed and reported all sorts of amazing things, and yet were wrong. And
all right. Okay, first of all, he's misunderstanding of Jonathan's reputation to the martyrdom of the disciples. He's not arguing that the disciples were martyred, that made them right about what they're saying. What he's saying is it means that they were telling the truth about what they were arguing, is what they mean. what he means. And that's what he was arguing. He was arguing for that specific thing. He was not arguing for their accuracy or reliability at that point. He was just simply arguing that they were not lying about it. Okay, that's the only thing he was pointing out. If Matt's willing to accept that, that's fine. He says he is in the debate, and I think he does in this rebuttal session even. He's wanted to accept the fact that they were sincerely true. I think he just skipped through saying something of that nature. But he thinks that, okay, they could be sincerely wrong. Well, yeah, they could be. They could be. But that was not the point of what Matt or Jonathan was trying to argue. That he was arguing for their integrity. Other things can be used to argue for their reliability, but he was arguing for their integrity. All right. There's also a strawman fallacy on Jonathan's arguments concerning martyrdom of the disciples versus other martyrdoms of other religions. The straw man is simply this: that one thing Matt is not, or Jonathan is not claiming that like I said, the disciples said that makes it true. That's not what he was arguing. And by the way, other disciples or other people of other religions, they die for what they heard was true and believed what they heard, and then they were willing to die for it. Same thing with modern Christians. But in the in that day, the disciples were there. They were witnesses. They heard it. They claimed it. We got a very early report found in 1 Corinthians 15. I'll probably go into that a little bit more as we continue. But we know the disciples were claiming that Jesus rose again from the dead. This is not coming from a hearsay report. This is coming directly from the disciples. The disciples were claiming this. Okay? And if the disciples were claiming that Jesus rose again from the dead, if they were claiming that Jesus rose again from the dead, then were they telling the truth? Or were they lying about it? It doesn't make them right or wrong. I mean, people can throw up assertions like maybe they were hallucinating or something of that nature, and we can deal with that if someone wants to throw up that as an objection. But did they fabricate the information? Is the saying, because they were there, they saw the event, they saw what happened. So it's not a question of, and this is not the same. This is again false analogy fallacy. It's a straw man because it misrepresents Jonathan's position because he's actually not arguing for the disciples being right about what they say there, at least with that particular point. He's arguing that they were honest about what they were saying, is what he was arguing. And of course, they were in a position to know whether they were right or not because they were there. But people of modern religions and things like that, they weren't there when that happened. They weren't there at the foundation of their religions. And again, Jonathan isn't arguing that makes him right. He's arguing it makes them telling the truth. In other words, they're not lying about it. Is what he's saying. If Matt's fine with the notion that they didn't lie, that's great. But that is still what Matt or Jonathan is arguing.
And if we were to use this standard of evidence of, hey, I've got an ancient book and nothing else, and from that we can infer that these people were writing and who they were writing to and what those people understood. I don't know that you wouldn't wind up letting in a bunch of other religions that you reject under that same standard of evidence.
All right. Okay. Matt appear to be using the word ancient or old. He does this throughout his rebuttal as well, by the way. He appears to be using these terms as if somehow the Bible being ancient book or old somehow makes it wrong or inaccurate or unreliable. You can't trust it if it's ancient. That will leave us to rejecting pretty much almost everything in ancient history. I mean, it would, because we wouldn't be able to accept anything in ancient history. Because guess what? It's all ancient. That's why they call it ancient history. But the fact that it's ancient has no implications of its reliability or anything like that. And of course, uh, and by the way, the Bible itself can be well. First of all, let me point out something. He's doing a common error that a lot of skeptics make when they assume the Bible is one source. But the Bible isn't one source. It's 66 sources. They weren't copied at the same time. The same person isn't writing them, and he treats it like this the whole time throughout this debate. He'll talk about it being he'll act like the Bible was written by one author, or he'll act like it's one source. You just have the Bible, and the point of doing that is pretty much to make it look like we only have one thing to go by instead of several things to go by. And this, of course, is it's not fallacious reasoning per se. It's just a factual inaccuracy. It's misleading to other people hearing that, because they're thinking, oh, you just have one source, okay, and when you have actually several to go on. And of course, Paul, 7 of his 13 epistles are undisputed. Nobody doubts that Paul wrote those epistles. Galatians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon. That's it. And to sit there and say that this Bible's anonymous, it's only written by one, no one knows who wrote it, as if it's written by one author, and say it's unsourced. Of course, he doesn't recognize. You understand what Matt argued? He doesn't recognize testimony as evidence. I'm going to clear something up on that, because clearly he doesn't recognize testimony as evidence. It is evidence. It is evidence. And it's sufficient enough to convince, because otherwise we would know next to nothing in history. Here's the thing. History is made entirely of evidence. Richard Bachman, in his book, Jesus and Eyewitnesses, I think I have it back over there. Yeah, I have it back over there on my bookshelf. In page 5, actually identify that testimony or history is made up of testimony. What does that mean? Entirely of testimony. It means that everything in history relies on testimony. We have, in fact, he says it's like all knowledge to rely on testimony, and it does. Because you think about it, the scope of a human person's experience is about this much compared to everything that goes on in the present and in the past. We're relying heavily on what other people tell us, whether it be at school, college, university campuses, whether we're dealing with the church, whether we're dealing with science, whether we're dealing with history. We're constantly relying on the testimony of others. And so ultimately, that's what we rely on. And the court system considers testimony as evidence. Obviously, it's strong enough to convince or be able to convince the legal system that something's true, because like Bill Cosby, for example, he was convicted on just about nothing but testimonies for something he did when he was a younger man, and he's old now, and this when he was a younger man. So obviously, testimony, people don't feel the same way about testimony as Matt does. Historians use testimony as evidence, and obviously it's strong enough to convince, or we will know next to nothing about history. Next to nothing about history. Now, we're going to get a little bit more into this, because it's going to eventually cover into what I like to call the claims not evidence argument that Matt likes to present. We won't be getting into it in this segment of my debate review series. I think we'll be getting into it the next time during the crossfire section between Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. in the third part of this series. Um, well, depending on whether or not if I decide to break the uh, crossfire section into two parts or not. If it's just one part, then it definitely will be on the third video. If it's in two parts, it could be anywhere from the third video to the fourth video. But either way, I'm going to present that. I'm also presenting a separate presentation eventually that will discuss a PowerPoint presentation that will discuss Matt's argument on this, because it's actually a fallacy in logic, but I'm not going to cover that at this point. The Bible is evidence. Some skeptics have this thing where they assume that we cannot use the Bible as evidence. As already mentioned, the Bible is not made of one source. It's 66 sources independently written from each other. Let's focus more specifically on the New Testament. Again, the New Testament itself is not one source. It is 27 sources. It's 27 works. These works were written independently of each other in the first century. They were not written in second century. They were first century literature written in first century. And even if you have no idea who wrote them, even if that was the case, it's not. But even if it was, it doesn't have no bearing on the historicity of those works. And also keep in mind, 7 of the 13 Pauline epistles is undisputed among scholars. And there's strong evidence behind Paul writing those 7 epistles. I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think I had cited Forged, Bart Ehrman's book in the last video, where I talked about those 7 epistles being undisputed and the reasons why they're undisputed. And Bart goes over some of those reasons. It's not the only reasons, but Bart goes over some of them in his the citation site. And obviously Paul's not. By the way, none of the 13 Pauline epistles are anonymous. They all identify as Paul. Even if he doesn't think Paul wrote it, they still identify themselves as Paul. Now, of course, we can actually use this as evidence. We can use the New Testament as evidence. Why? Because skeptics use it as evidence. Yes, they do. It can be used as evidence. They use it as evidence all the time. Richard Carey is an atheist and a mythicist and uses 1 Corinthians 15. He takes it out of context, but he still uses it. Bart Ehrman uses it in his book, How Jesus Became God. He used Romans 4. I think it's Romans 4. Either Romans 4 or Romans 5, somewhere in there. And he uses that. Again, a lot of times they're notorious for taking things out of context or misusing it or abusing it or something of that nature, but they still use it as evidence. They still present it as evidence. If they can do it, we can certainly do it. Even on college campuses, even secular universities allow you to. My wife was going to the national campus of the Phoenix University, and there they were doing her English class, they did a debate over abortion. And my wife asked the teacher, and this is a secular university, and based upon the teacher's remarks in my wife's paper, I think that she probably was pro-choice. And of course, my wife is like me, pro-life. And she sat there and asked the question when they first presented this, because she was one of the ones that was going to debate over the abortion thing. And she said, can we use the Bible as evidence? And the teacher said, yes, as long as you back up what you use. That's what the difference is. We have to back it up. That doesn't mean necessarily that we have to have another source saying the same thing. That could be, but we could back it up in other ways, such as using scholarly control techniques and things like that. And that's what we do. We backed up what is being said here. We don't just simply assume inerrancy when we're arguing the position. Whether instead we back it up. We can back it up in a number of ways. We can back it up by quoting an external source. We can back it up by using scholarly criteria like multiple attestation, criteria of embarrassment, and others. We can go into those kinds of details, and we can back it up. But this idea that we cannot use the Bible as evidence and somehow the Bible is barred from being used as evidence, it's been disproven. It's not true. If I was debating, or even Jonathan, and Jonathan's debated some scholars like Richard Carey before, and he has a completely different other conversation with them as he does with Matt. They don't just dismiss everything he brings to the table, even if they don't agree with him. Has any Christian apologist ever brought up Acts to a atheist like Richard Carrier or Bart Ehrman? Yeah. Do they just haphazardly dismiss it? No. That don't mean they agree with it. They don't agree with it. But they know that it can be submitted as evidence. They just have to target that particular evidence and why they don't think it's um, something that they think is strong or proves a conclusion or whatnot, or sufficient to prove anything or something of that nature. But they'd have to show reasons behind it. They wouldn't just simply say, "Well, I don't agree with that, so it can't be used as evidence." That's not how they do it. That's not how they do it. All right. Well, we covered that. So let's continue.
But he mentioned at one point that the best explanation for the actions of those people is my paraphrasing is that God took human form, sacrificed himself, resurrected, and left no strong evidence, or left nothing that I would consider strong evidence. I guess we're debating. Jonathan seems to think that it's strong evidence. I don't know how you reach the conclusion.
God did leave very strong evidence. Just because Matt Dillahunty is not convinced of it doesn't mean that God didn't leave strong evidence. The strong evidence of the testimony of the disciples. By the way, I forgot to mention this. He mentioned earlier, why wouldn't you accept other claims on the basis of the same evidence? Because they don't have the same kind of evidence. I mean, if you look at Siddhartha Buddhism, the earliest thing we have on Buddhism, either the biography of Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, or Buddhism itself, is 500 years later. 500 years later. Look at Islam. Quran is mostly about Jesus, but yet it's 6 centuries later. The earliest biography we have of Muhammad is 125 to 150 years later. We don't accept those testimonies because of the fact that the evidence doesn't support those testimonies. The evidence does support the testimonies of the disciples. We have the disciples proclaiming it directly from the eyewitnesses themselves. It's appearing very early in early materials such as 1 Corinthians 15 Creed. We have it appearing in the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul, which earlier than what we have from the Gospels. We have it multiply attested, early attested, found in numerous creedal and hymn forms and things like that. And, multiple sources outside the Bible in reference to Jesus' crucifixion and Jesus' burial being reported very, very early. I mean, I'm going by the case that I usually make, crucifixion, burial, empty tomb, resurrection appearances of the disciples, Paul's conversion to Christianity, James's conversion to Christianity. And my 7th fact is the origin of the Christian faith, because the Christian faith was birthed in the fact, or originated from or based upon a crucified Messiah that had risen from the dead, and due to the messianic expectations and their beliefs about crucifixion and their concept of resurrection. This kind of things needed to be explained, because you cannot account for the origin of Christianity at all apart from Jesus' resurrection from the dead. This is all very strong evidence, and none of these facts are independently somehow miraculous in nature or inaccessible by the historian. But when these put together into a cumulative case, they make for a very powerful case in favor of Jesus' resurrection. So God does grant us strong evidence. The fact that Matt not convinced has more to do with his epistemology, and we will discuss that in a little bit. but has more to do with his epistemology than it does with the evidence. All right, let's continue. I think he's fixing to make a common strawman argument that he likes to make.
That magic is a more likely option than demonstrably flawed thinkers thinking flawed.
All right. He makes two fallacies here. The first one is strawman fallacy, which is obvious. Does any Christian claim that magic rose Jesus from the dead? No. Does anyone claim that it's magic that reason why Jesus is risen from the dead? No. I understand he's an atheist, a naturalist, and he rejects all aspect of the supernatural, and he is also a magician, and maybe the word magic is the best way he can account for miracles in his mind, or a miracle happening in his mind, or the power of God or whatnot. But it's not magic. It's not defined as magic. Magic is defined as a like an inward supernatural act of some sort that's happening on, that somehow. I actually looked up the definition a while back and I can't remember it, but basically to the effect of, it's like an effect on something happening, like a trick of some kind. But the reality of it is that Jesus rising again from the dead wasn't magic. Nobody claims it's magic. We don't claim it's magic. We claim it's by the power of God, but that's not the same as magic. We're not saying it's magic. And there is a difference between that, because with a lot of magical acts of pagans and stuff, they're relying on, either other divine beings, to do something, and they're doing it themselves. But with God, he himself raised Jesus from the dead. So no, magic didn't raise Jesus from the dead. We don't claim otherwise. This is a strawman fallacy. Again, I understand Matt's situation enough to understand why he would try to argue that. So I'm not saying something terrible against Matt for arguing that way. I understand where he's coming from. The problem, however, is that we, as the person who holds the argument he's attacking, don't argue that. That's the issue. Now, what about the second fallacy? He makes another fallacy in about the fact that these people are demonstrably flawed, thinking flawed. Is that more possible? Is that more? That's called the appeal to possibility fallacy. It's when you assume that something, just because something is possible, means it's probable. Well, it's probable because it is possible that this could be true. It might be possible. I mean, sometimes when people do the appeal to possibility fallacy, isn't as well known as some of the other fallacies like red herring or strawman. But it's made a lot in debates. You hear people doing it all the time. And don't confuse them with hypothetical situations. Sometimes people make hypothetical situations to prove points or something of that nature. But what it does do is it assumes that if something is possible, then it's probable. And people do that in a lot of debates, like, well, isn't it possible that this could be true or this could be true? And usually when someone throws up an appeal to possibility fallacy, I just say, yeah, it's possible, but it's also possible, I'll do something humorous, and I'll say, yeah, it's possible that the disciples were really space aliens from the planet Zuzu, and just for the fun of it, they decided to raise Jesus from the dead. Doesn't mean it's probable, doesn't mean it's what happened, but it's possible. You could, if you get creative with it, just about anything could be possible, but that doesn't necessarily make it the case. Sometimes my wife would get into this kind of thing, because this kind of argument, because she would say, well, isn't it possible that, or she might not say the word possible, but she would say that you just think you're right all the time. Argument, and I would say no. I don't think I'm right all the time, but that don't mean I'm wrong all the time either. And this is where the fallacy in the reasoning happens. She's arguing basically, since it's possible I could be wrong, then that makes me wrong. No, it doesn't. I could be right. I have a chance that I could be wrong, but I also have a chance I could be right. And the question is what the evidence points to. All right, let's continue.
I don't see that there's anything to explain here. There's just a claim. It'd be like saying, hey, I saw this guy walk on water. How do you explain that? Well, was it maybe frozen underneath it? Did he get like a plexiglass thing and put it underneath it so that it hid that? Why am I trying to explain how this event happened when the only thing that we have to say that the event happened is somebody's claim that it actually happened? Meanwhile, I've seen people do that exact trick on TV, but he presented what he called a maximal data case, but it was bare bones because of time. And
okay. Testimony counts as evidence. I already mentioned this. It definitely counts as evidence. As time goes on, we'll go more into that. I just want you to understand that he's basically denying that testimony counts as evidence. He calls them claims. A testimony is a type of claim. It's a testimonial claim. But it's some types of claims can count as evidence. He's going to argue that no claim can count as evidence, and we're going to see that in a little bit. And it actually commits a fallacy in logic, and we'll talk about that later in a little bit.
Meanwhile, I've seen people do that exact trick on TV, but he presented what he called a maximal data case, but it was bare bones because of time. And so we begin with after Jesus died and was buried. And my question is, did that actually happen? Jesus' followers would have been surprised as anybody else. I don't understand it.
All right. Before we get back into the surprise of the disciples, we actually have a very good, a lot of good evidence for Jesus, both Jesus' death and his resurrection. Even some stuff outside the New Testament. I know Jonathan mainly focused on the New Testament, and of course Matt jumped on this, and those people who support him jumped on this. But we actually have evidence outside of the New Testament for, let's say, Jesus' crucifixion, for example. We have a number of sources, at least 5, maybe 6 if you're willing to accept secondhand sources, as historians do. But 5 of them for sure, there's dates really early. Josephus, Tacitus, you got Jewish Talmud, you got Lucian of Samara, you got, who by the way mentions Jesus' crucifixion twice. You also have Marabara Serpion, who also mentions Jesus' death. He doesn't mention the crucifixion of Jesus, but he mentions his death. And these are very early sources. Josephus is writing in 1st century. Yep. Tacitus is writing in very early 2nd century, extremely early 2nd century, but he had lived in 1st century. He was a Roman official and he had access to Roman records. He's actually considered one of the greatest of all Roman historians. And so, he referenced Jesus' crucifixion, his death by crucifixion, as well as the reigning Roman emperor at the time, agreeing with the New Testament that it was Tiberius Caesar, and that was reigning at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And of course, we have a number of Christian sources that also testify to Jesus' crucifixion outside the New Testament. And of course, we have the New Testament itself. We got early creed, the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, which has Jesus' death in it. His crucifixion is referenced in numerous sources. At least 6 out of the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul reference Jesus' crucifixion. So we got a number of sources. We also have sources of Jesus' resurrection, numerous sources both inside the Bible and out. We have references to his resurrection found in Tacitus, because Tacitus references his resurrection. Pagans, of course, didn't believe in a bodily resurrection, so Tacitus referred to it as the most mischievous superstition. So he didn't agree with it, but yet he referenced it. People were saying that Jesus rose again from the dead. So interesting enough, we have evidence outside it, but our best evidence is going to be in the New Testament because that's our earliest sources for it. And so they reference it. The First Corinthians 15 Creed is both biblical in a sense and non-biblical in another sense, and extra biblical, or not non-biblical, but extra biblical, because it's biblical in the sense because the creed is being presented in First Corinthians 15 in the letter written by Paul, First Corinthians, but it is also extra biblical in the sense that it predates the letter in which it's included in, and Paul and this creed does not originate with Paul. Paul gets it somewhere. He gets it directly from the disciples. This can be shown in the fact that he has this meeting with the disciples early on. He records it. He references it in Galatians 1 and 2, where he has this meeting 3 years after his conversion. Most scholars state his conversion within 2 to 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion. So you're looking at this creed predating AD 36, most likely AD 35. So and of course the creed already existed, and if Peter and James is handling it to Paul, then Paul received this creedal information, or Peter and James had this creedal information before Paul. So that makes the creed even earlier. And then you got a couple years for it to formulate from Aramaic. The origin of the creed would have been Aramaic and into Greek. And so this creed winds up being within a couple of years of Jesus' crucifixion. And at the very beginning of this creed, it proclaims Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection right there at the beginning of it. And this is very early material. I mean, look how Peter is referencing the creed. It references him by his Aramaic name, Cephas. It would not, if this was a later edition, it would never use Peter's Aramaic name. It would use his Greek name, Petros, or Peter in English. And it would have referenced his Greek name, but it doesn't. It references his Aramaic name, which means this creed is extremely early. Yeah, so we do have this evidence. We do have early evidence. We do have the testimonies of the disciples. He's about to get on the surprise issue. I'm going to let him finish that thought real quick, and then I'll just kind of reiterate a point that I made earlier.
They would have necessarily been a surprise to anybody else, though I would certainly realize that somebody resurrecting is going to be a surprise. It's just funny that the people who were...
All right. Again, Matt kind of misunderstood what, the surprise, why the disciples would be surprised. Of course, it's not what Jonathan means by it anyhow, but they would have been surprised by it because they didn't expect anyone to rise again from the dead before the general resurrection at the end of the world. This shows that Matt is unfamiliar with the culture of the time, and why they would have that assessment. If he did, he would know exactly why they would be surprised.
His followers, we don't seem to have a lot of accounts from it. 1 Corinthians 15.
All right. He says that we do not have a lot of accounts from them, but Matt is presupposing his position with the Gospels in the New Testament. Obviously, he's presupposing the authorship of the Gospels are completely unknown. It's not anonymous. Does not mean that we had no idea who wrote them, because we do have external sources. It's actually a bit of a cherry picking as well, because to sit there and say, well, the Gospels don't say they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is cherry picking, because it's in the case of Bart Ehrman, when Bart Ehrman does it, he's intentionally doing it. It's clear that he's intentionally doing it. When he was debating Michael Kona in their debate on the history of the Gospels, he intentionally cherry picked, and then Mike just kind of redirected his attention back to the fact that we have external sources that do identify the authorship of the Gospels. And so he was intentionally cherry picking. I don't know if Matt's intentionally cherry picking or he really is unfamiliar with external sources. But I don't think he's unfamiliar with external sources, because I don't know if at this point he might not have had the debate with Jonathan Sheffield. I don't know if he had that debate with him yet on Modern Day Debate. I plan on maybe eventually doing a debate review of that, because the authorship of the Gospel is something I have, studied and stuff. And but in that debate, Jonathan mentioned that that we have this external evidence of confirmation the Gospels and who wrote the Gospels. So I don't think he's ignorant of it. And if he's not ignorant of it, then he's intentionally cherry picking, which I don't like saying someone intentionally makes a logical fallacy. Most people usually don't intentionally make a logical fallacy; it's just accidentally. But some people do, and when you do, it comes across like you're accusing them of lying. Well, I'm not trying to. That's not the my goal. Um, but the fact of the matter is that if you know that there's external evidence. Now, in Matt's defense, though, I don't think Matt realizes that testimony counts as that, or he doesn't. At least he doesn't think testimony counts as evidence. So when I present testimony that other people are saying that who wrote the Gospels, he probably doesn't count that as evidence. So in his mind, he probably doesn't think he's cherry picking at all because he does not classify that as evidence. So that's possible. If that is, then he's not intentionally per se cherry picking. He is cherry picking, but he might not be doing it intentionally. He's just following his line of reasoning, which says that testimony doesn't count as evidence. Or like a lot of skeptics might say, oh, they're biased testimony, so it can't count as evidence, which is false. We're all biased in our own way. The bias doesn't make us wrong or have inaccurate information on the Bible. That in itself is a fallacy, actually, but we ain't gonna go there right now. That wasn't the main object of this debate. Isn't really over the Gospel's authorship in the first place. So it does actually commit a red herring in the process. All right. All right. He's about to get on to Paul, which is interesting because he's about to argue that Paul wasn't present at all during his ministry, which he has zero evidence for. He's asserting it. The burden of proof is on him, but let's see if he backs it up with evidence.
And 3 is Paul. Paul, and by the way, this is all of it. So the bulk of Jonathan's case is Paul and Luke, And so Paul is not a witness. He's not a witness to the life, ministry, death, or resurrection of Jesus. So I don't know how anything that Paul ever says could be considered strong evidence for the resurrection when he's not remotely an eyewitness. He claims to have had an experience with the risen Jesus after that, but there's no demonstration, no evidence for that. Paul expects the church in Corinthians to...
All right. There was 2 things he said there. I'm not sure, but yeah, I don't think I actually put it in my notes about what he said on Paul not having any evidence of actually seeing Jesus. I'll get to that in a minute because even though I didn't put it in the notes, I do want to address it. It says, why does Matt think that Paul was not an eyewitness to the life, death, resurrection? He might not have seen the first resurrection, the first time he rose again from death, but he was present during his life and death. Or at least, how does Matt know that he wasn't? His question. Remember, he's making the assertion, so he owes the burden of proof. But he says that he wasn't there. Well, how does he know that? What evidence does he have? Well, Jonathan's going to challenge them that later on. It won't be in this part of the video of my series, but probably maybe in the next one. But Jonathan's going to challenge him on this and ask him, okay, what evidence you have for this? And he's going to say, well, because Paul doesn't say he is, which is an argument from silence. We'll get to that in the next time around when Paul is brought up again. Of course, we have evidence, both of the Jesus disciples seeing it. I referenced 1 Corinthians 15, Creed, which is coming directly from the eyewitnesses. He's getting it from James and Peter. James and Peter were both present in both the meetings that he has early on with the disciples. The first meeting, he said that in Galatians 1, he says that he met with Peter and James and no one else. He said there was nobody else at the meeting except them. But this is interesting because Peter and James is the only ones that are referenced directly in the creed. This is huge because it's much bigger than most people think it is. Because creeds were usually very generalized. They didn't give specific names and things like that. But this gave the specific name of Peter and James. Very unusual for a creed, but it's in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. This is a huge hint to where he's getting his information from. Then after he presents the creed, he says, whether it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believe. Well, who is the they, the antecedent of they, in his passage? Well, the last group appearance that he references is the disciples. He says they appeared to the 12. So the antecedent is the disciples. He knew that him and the disciples were on the same page. How did he know that? Because he checked his information out previously. That's why. That's the only logical conclusion, which leads us to the evidence that this is extremely early, that it's going back to the disciples. The 1 Corinthians 15 creed was not originated with Paul. Paul's getting it from somewhere, and he's not getting it from, stories passing around. No, he's getting it directly from the disciples themselves, directly from the eyewitnesses. And by the way, Paul's own testimony counts as evidence of his resurrection conviction. Richard Carrier, he's an atheist and a mythicist. He's actually, I would classify him as a radical scholar. I think all other scholars would probably classify him as a radical scholar as well. Someone who takes extreme positions. And this is probably one of the most extreme persons I know in scholarship. Well, Richard Carrier was in a debate with Michael Kona. And in the debate with Michael Kona, toward the end of the debate, there was a Q&A session. There usually is in most debates. And someone asked Michael Kona, is there any non-Christian sources testifying to Paul's conversion to Christianity? Mike answered, well, it'd be great if we had that, but all we have is testimony that he converted from Christianity, or converted to Christianity. And Richard Carrier spoke up and gave my favorite quotation, my favorite citation of Jesus's or Paul's conversion to Christianity. And I use this when I argue for fact number 5 of my case of Paul was converted to Christianity as a result of his resurrection experience, and what resurrection of this is having this experience where he claimed that he saw the risen Christ. Well, at any rate, Richard Carrier spoke up and he said, and this is what Richard said, I think that Paul's own own testimony is enough to Paul's own testimony is enough to prove his conversion to Christianity. His own testimony. So Paul's testimony is the evidence that he was converted to Christianity. It is the evidence that the reason he was converted to Christianity is because of the resurrection appearance. Because remember, he adds himself to the creed when he does this. He says, last of all, he appeared to me also. Last of all, he also appeared to me. And he says, who was not worthy of his apostleship because he had persecuted the church of God. Paul's own testimony is enough to convince us that he was converted to Christianity. It's enough. It is evidence. It is qualified as evidence. Matt denying that is not going to make it the case. All right, let's continue.
Understand him? Of course he does, because they've heard the same stories. Paul tries to do this, he's the least of the apostles. Yeah, apostles, yes, because he wasn't actually there.
Also, I'm going to talk about it because he misunderstands what Paul means by least of the apostles. But I already mentioned we have evidence for them as our witnesses coming to it. It's not because they're hearing stories around, but they're getting that directly from the eyewitnesses. All right, least of the apostles. That's what Paul called himself. Least of the apostles. Matt says, "Oh, well, of course he's the least of the apostles because he wasn't actually there." No, that's not what Paul means. Paul means that when he says he's the least of the apostles, what he means is that he was not there for his ministry directly. Like he didn't follow Jesus around. He didn't believe Jesus was, the Christ and so forth. And that he wasn't converted until after Jesus already died by crucifixion, when his resurrected form appeared to him. And that's what he means when he says least of the apostles. He's not saying, oh, well, I didn't know Jesus at all, or knew who he was and what he looked like, or was there for his crucifixion. That's not what he's arguing. That's what Matt's saying, ultimately. But that's not what Paul's saying. That's not what he means when he says least of the apostles. So he actually misunderstands Paul.
Luke is a companion, and so he's going to back up this story. Can we trust Luke Acts? It's supposedly grounded in eyewitness testimony, and yet we have no way to investigate or determine that there is in fact eyewitness testimony, or how reliable those eyewitnesses are, or what the nature of their actual accounts is. It's like saying, hey, I've got a bunch of witnesses and you can't talk to them. Is exactly what we're dealing with here. Luke claims that he spoke to eyewitnesses. So what? That doesn't tell us whether or not their testimony is reliable or accurate. The second test that he presented for Luke, I didn't get to.
All right. Okay. We went through like 3 different points here that I want to address. All right. He basically misunderstands Jonathan's position. Jonathan is basically arguing that Luke knew Paul and could testify to what Paul was saying. He's not arguing that makes Paul right, or that the Jesus' resurrection. What Jonathan is doing is he's setting up an inductive argument. In which case, with inductive reasoning, I'll talk more about this when we get to the closing argument, because there's a big issue back and forth on this because Matt gets really offensive because he looks like he doesn't understand an inductive argument, and Jonathan pounced on it, and Matt got mad about it and treated his closing argument like it was a rebuttal, and we'll get more into that later on when we deal with the closing argument. But it actually misunderstands what Jonathan is trying to argue here, because Jonathan isn't with the inductive argument. Like I said, you're arguing particular or particular to generalities. You never argue from generalities to particular. That's a deductive argument. That's not what Jonathan is doing here. He's not saying that Jesus rose again from the dead just because Acts was written by someone who knew Paul. Because Matt keeps on acting, and as Jonathan pointed out in his debate review video with Timothy McGrew, it's like Matt keeps on assuming that Jonathan's trying to make a beeline for the resurrection every single time, and he misses the point of an inductive argument. Because the inductive argument, you're not doing that. You're arguing from particular to particular, or particular to generalities. In Jonathan's case, he's arguing from particular to particular, which means he is doing an inductive argument. And so he misunderstands that, and he commits a fallacy in logic, actually, called the fallacy of missing the point. This is an argument or a fallacy in reasoning, in which the person is. He basically misses. It's also called the fallacy of irrelevant question, the fallacy of the irrelevant issue. All these things are true. Sometimes it's done in the form of a question to try to throw out an irrelevant claim or something of that nature. But but sometimes it's not. In Matt's case, it's not. He's not presenting it in the form of a question, but he is missing the point, because Jonathan is not arguing that the fact that Luke is a traveling companion of Paul means Jesus rose again from the dead. That's not what he was arguing. Just like when he's arguing that the disciples were honest about what they're saying, he isn't arguing that means Jesus rose again from the dead. That's not what he's arguing. He's saying they're not lying about it, is what he's arguing for. And so Matt appears to be doing this fallacy quite extensively. He seems to miss the point of everything that Jonathan is arguing here, and he keeps on trying to throw it right back to the conclusions. That means Jonathan's case is like every other resurrection case. It's a cumulative argument. And in a cumulative argument, each fact builds upon itself the other facts until finally you get to a cumulative effect, the totality of the evidence that points to the resurrection. So it isn't just one strand of data. It isn't just one piece of evidence. It isn't just one individual fact. It's the whole shebang that's being considered. And that's ultimately what proves that Jesus rose again from the dead. But Matt, however, he is looking for evidence. He is looking for evidence that just right up proves that Jesus rose again from the dead without a cumulative case. This is a cumulative case. And a pet peeve of mine, because I do it like all people who's ever talked on the resurrection, I like doing a cumulative case for the resurrection too, because that's what I do. And my pet peeve of mine is when someone takes even when I'm watching the debate, someone takes a fact out, an individual fact out, and then says that that don't prove Jesus rose again from the dead, as if we're proving Jesus rose again with that one fact. But it's a cumulative effect. It's a cumulative fact. So I'm not trying to prove Jesus rose again from that one fact. I'm not trying to prove Jesus rose again because I can prove that he was, died by crucifixion. That's one individual fact. Each fact has a purpose in the case, but it's a totality effect. It's a cumulative effect of all the evidence and facts put together. And Matt doesn't seem to understand that. He keeps acting and treating like every fact and evidence Jonathan presents is intended to conclusively prove that Jesus rose again from the dead. If they can't do that, then you can't even bring it up. You shouldn't even bring it up. It has no impact whatsoever. And that's the way Matt is thinking, but it is completely flawed. Let's continue.
To jot down the first one, was that the evidence that Luke was a traveling companion is irrelevant, because traveling partners, like if I told you that I saw Elvis after he was dead, and that there were a bunch of other people who saw it too, and then my traveling companion comes along and says, yep, Matt said he saw Elvis. That doesn't do anything to tell us whether or not I saw Elvis. The we that he referenced, that's two people who weren't there for the ministry, death, or proposed resurrection. We.
All right. Again, I've got 2 points down. On the first point, it's the fallacy of missing the point again. Jonathan's argument there with Luke involved with the eyewitnesses were claiming not rather they were reliable or not. In other words, he was just simply saying, all right, we know what the eyewitnesses were claiming. Luke was an acquaintance of the eyewitnesses, an acquaintance of Paul. He knew what Paul was saying. He knew what the eyewitnesses were saying. That was the point that Jonathan was making. Again, he makes a beeline to the resurrection. They don't prove that he rose again from the dead. He talked about the we passages in Luke, and he says that that's two people that weren't there. First of all, it's more than two people. It isn't just two individuals there. Secondly, the disciples were among those we. So were the disciples not there at Jesus' resurrection? And obviously he's claiming Paul. Well, Paul was a first-hand account of his own experience of Jesus appearing to him. And he adds himself to the creed in 1 Corinthians 15. So why does he just kind of assume that, that nobody was there for the resurrection? How do you know that Luke wasn't there? You don't know. We don't know if Luke was there or not. He doesn't tell us. We don't know.
And so I don't know how it can remotely count as good evidence or strong evidence. At best, you've got second or third hand accounts. John?
Of course, historians accept second-hand account. In fact, they do it all the time as evidence. So the fact that, we would rather have first-hand accounts. Don't get me wrong. The first-hand account obviously is stronger than the second-hand account, but second-hand account is still considered evidence by the historian.
20 is a passage from an anonymous book, and he's convinced that it was written by John. And I get that. I understand why people do, but it's not like we can demonstrate that at all. And if you pick up, if you look into the Bibles, the only thing we can say is that we don't know for sure who wrote that, and that all of our copies are anonymous. The author, the impressive thing there was that the author knows the name of the priest. Well,
all right. He said John is considered anonymous. Yeah, it's classified as anonymous, but that's not, just because the name of the author is not specifically identified in the text itself. Now, John's gospel, interesting enough, is the closest of the four gospels it comes to identifying its writer, since it says that the person who's writing this is he who leaned on Jesus' breast, and he's the beloved disciple and so forth. John's gospel makes a lot of references that they're very close to identifying the writer, even though the writer doesn't specifically identify his name. But scholars would label it as anonymous because it doesn't identify his name. But this doesn't mean that we have no idea who wrote it. I mean, we do have an idea who wrote it because we got evidence of it outside of the Bible that testifies to John the Apostle writing the Gospel of John. So, yeah. And what about this thing where he says that all of our copies are anonymous? This is completely incorrect. All the copies that we have of any of the Gospels, all four Gospels, not just John's, all four Gospels. If we look at the copies of the Gospels, if they're a Gospel manuscript, and if we have enough of the copies to identify the title. Now, obviously, we have fragments that don't have the title or don't have the title page and stuff because they're too fragmentary. In those cases, we don't know if the titles are there or not because we don't have enough of it to see. It would be special pleading to say that it was, and it would be an argument from silence to say that it was not. We just don't know. We don't have the evidence one way or the other. But all the manuscript copies that we do have, those others are pure speculation if you want to assert that they did have manuscript titles on them. But all the ones that we have, they're complete enough to see the title page, have the gospel titles on them. All of them do. That we have enough of the manuscript to see the title page. So I'm not saying that doesn't mean that it was in the original. I'm not saying it was on the original manuscripts. I don't know if it was or not. But what I am saying is it's factually incorrect to say all of our copies are anonymous. As far as the titles go, the titles are written on the manuscript copies by the scribes. All of them write the manuscript that's complete enough that we know what the titles is, have the title page and stuff. And they all have the titles, and they're all Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're never anybody else. So what he says is just factually incorrect. Let's continue.
Assuming that there's any sort of investigation or discussion to be had, A, how do we know that he's right about the name of the priest? And what difference does it make if he's right about the name of the priest? It's like knowing, that Colonel Parker managed us. I didn't meet either one of them, and yet these are facts that I know.
Again, he's doing the fallacy of missing the point. Jonathan is not arguing for historicity at that point. Rather, he's arguing for the authorship of John's gospel at that point. He's not arguing for the historicity of John's gospel. So that was the fallacy missing point. He threw up an irrelevant issue involving its historicity, which is not what John was going at when he was arguing for the priest in his open case. He was just trying to simply show that John's gospel is written by an eyewitness, is what he's saying. All right, let's continue. Now,
Things are a little bit different here in the sense that I have access to a lot more information than disciples did, and I don't want to be anachronistic. However, when I listened to Jonathan going through his rebuttal, he basically went over the same points that he made. I hopefully have cleared up that my distinction over the myth thing is not me overlooking that he included legend and just dismissed it. It's that the way that he included legend, I don't feel is dismissible.
All right. We already went over the myth and legend thing. He obviously misunderstood that. Let's continue.
The accounts that there was a Jesus person, I'm okay with. The accounts that Jesus died, well, I'm convinced that Jesus died. If he existed, I'm convinced he died because That's just the way life works. That everybody who's ever existed has either died or is still alive. It's curious that I'm, talking with people who think that are one of the only exceptions to someone who both died and is still alive.
Now, I understand. In Matt's argumentation, he's not arguing that there's good evidence for Jesus' death in life, because he doesn't think there is. There is, but that's only because he doesn't accept testimony as either evidence or as good evidence. And as a result, he doesn't think there's any real good evidence to convince him of that that's the case. But he's willing to, for the sake of argument, concede to it, because he's conceding to Jesus, living, because he doesn't consider himself a mythicist. Then he's willing to say that he must have died in the eventual scheme of things. And that's ultimately what he's arguing. I just want to be able to clarify that so you understand that he doesn't think that there's strong evidence for Jesus' crucifixion, even though there is. So that way you can understand where Matt's coming from is not in the place you think, oh, well, he agrees that Jesus died by crucifixion, so he must agree with the evidence for it. No, it's not that. It's more to do with him willing to at least admit that Jesus lived, and then he's willing to admit that Jesus died because he's willing to admit that he lived. That's pretty much what it comes down to.
And yet they can't produce that person to come in here and defend any of this, and which is why for hundreds and thousands of years now, we've just been sitting around arguing. He mentioned that I'm not sure what sort of evidence could be presented, and that this is somehow a flaw in my epistemology. That's a load of crap.
All right. By the way, the fact that something is disputed has no bearing on whether it's true or not. So I don't know why he seems to try to imply that, well, we wouldn't be still fighting about it if it was the case. No, it's not the case. And someone will have to go in and tell you about it for you to know that it's true. I mean, you can still look at evidence and things like that. If for example, if someone says if we're trying to, let's say we're trying to prove that someone had died, but they went missing for a long time, could you prove that? Even though they're not coming in and say, yep, I was almost dead, but I'm not. Well, you could probably prove that they were dead if, say, for example, if you have evidence of it, like they went into a war-torn country and maybe their blood was found, or some kind of piece of evidence or something like that. Or maybe let's say someone saw him get killed but get dragged away by the enemy, and therefore that's why his body came up missing, and then the person testifies to that counts as evidence. You don't have to have the person come in and say, hey, look, this happened. You can look at evidence and still assess that. Cold case detectives do it all the time, because especially when the witnesses are not even available to them anymore. And so they have to, they're forced into a situation where they have to do that. What about this flaw in Matt's epistemology? He definitely has a flaw in his epistemology. Let me discuss his flaw in his epistemology real quick. His epistemology is basically self-defeating. Okay, on one half of his epistemology, he says nothing can be proven absolutely. He doesn't even think this is called Cartesian certainty, where you can be absolutely certain about something. And he doesn't think he can be absolutely certain even about your own existence. He doesn't. But the other half of his epistemology says that he has to be absolutely convinced that something is true for him to believe it's true. That's why he keeps jumping to, if it was evidence, it would be guaranteed that it's the case. No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't guarantee it, but he wants it guaranteed. He wants it guaranteed. If it's not guaranteed, it can't be proof. It can't be evidence. And so that's the other side of epistemology. And this is why he sets the standard so high that nothing in history would pass it. He wanting blood samples, DNA evidence. He wants to be able to talk to the witnesses. He wants those kinds of standards of evidence. And unfortunately, nothing in history would ever pass that. But that's what he wants. His epistemology is set up so no matter what, If Matt Dillahunty doesn't want to be convinced of it, he's not going to be convinced of it. If Matt Dillahunty doesn't want to acknowledge that source, to acknowledge that evidence, he's not going to acknowledge it. His epistemology is set up so no matter what, the resurrection fails in his mind. That is a flawed epistemology. And I've said this, Matt said, or Jonathan said something similar to what I've said. It's similar to what I've said, basically. Because he talked about his epistemology. He said, of course, I didn't show you that. That's during Matt's or Jonathan's either his opening case or his rebuttal, where he talks about well, he questions whether Matt's epistemology is a sound epistemology or evidence-based epistemology, I think is what Jonathan said. And I said something similar. I said that Matt's epistemology, if someone's standard of evidence is so high that nothing can convince you of it, then that means that you're something wrong with, because you have to be convincible. You have to be convincible. You have to be able to be convinced. You have to at least be open to being convinced. If you're not open to being convinced, and if he sets a standard so high that nothing can convince him, he says that he thinks that things convince him. He can't give you an example of what will convince him, but he thinks that things can convince him. He thinks God would know. And I often sit there, I came up with this idea a while back too. If Matt ever says, oh, well, I think God would know what would convince me. Well, I like to ask Matt a question, if he's watching this review or something. What if God knows exactly what would convince you and it's nothing? Because you've set your epistemology up in a way that nothing can convince you. Not unless you want to be convinced. Not unless you're willing to be open to being convinced. And I don't think Matt is. I don't think Matt Dillahunty is open to being convinced. Let's continue.
Because what needs to be demonstrated is a causal connection and a realistic connection to show that the supernatural is real, that it can interact with the material world. I don't know what shape that evidence will come. It will convince me the instant it's there. And none of it matters because God could present this evidence. And this is one of the things that I tried to address, that if God comes in and says, hey, I can present all the best evidence for you, but I'm not going to. Even him just saying that would be leaps and bounds better evidence than anything that we currently have. So it's not like I need to explain an empty tomb because I'm not aware that there is any empty tomb to explain. And thousands of years after something, I don't even know what finding an empty tomb would be. What I'm being asked to explain is how
All right. I think I missed a few things. He said something to the effect of you need to prove the supernatural to prove that Jesus rose from the dead. But this is a circular reasoning. This is referenced by Matt Dillahunty or Mike Winger in his opening case against Matt Dillahunty on Capturing Christianity, where on YouTube, where Mike Winger mentions that this is a circular argument, and it is a circular argument. He's absolutely right. Matt comes back in the rebuttal session and says, well, this is not a circular argument because a circular argument is when you assume your conclusion in your premise, that your premise assumes your conclusion. Well, that's true. That's exactly what a circular argument is. Matt's right. But that's exactly what Matt is doing. Matt's assuming his conclusion. He assumes that supernatural is not real. We have evidence that supernatural is real. For example, the resurrection itself would be the evidence that supernatural is true, or among them at least. And we have strong evidence that Jesus rose again from the dead. But then Matt would look at that and say, nope, you have to prove the supernatural to prove the resurrection. And the resurrection is the proof, but he rejects that because it's not proof of the proof. He's ultimately arguing in a circle. He's assuming his worldview. He assumes his worldview is true. Right there from the start, he assumes it. He has this presuppositions on his sleeves is what he ultimately has. I always dealt with Matt's argument on what would convince him, because his standard's so high, nothing can convince him. And I already mentioned the thing about God. I think that's ironic that he thinks he can somehow divinely or psychologically evaluate a divine being of some sort, and think he knows what they would do or what they would think, and that they have to somehow present evidence for, and again, even telling him that would be evidence enough. Except even then, he wouldn't be convinced by it. He would always come up with some sort of excuse or some sort of reason why it's just not the case. All right, let's continue. I think he's fixing to get into the empty tomb.
A report from an anonymous source or several anonymous sources that don't agree. You can't put the different resurrection accounts together and come up with a cohesive story because they're in disagreement about what happened when. And we have no demonstration of an empty tomb or a death on a cross or a resurrection or even the details of any specific sermon. And I just did a video the other day on the loaves and fishes and how absolutely absurd it is to think that there were thousands of people following Jesus around in the first century in this area and nobody brought any food. I mean, this is the level that we're talking about.
All right. Several points. All right. We have evidence for the empty tomb. Okay. Got the women being the chief witness in the tomb. That's not, something that, in that culture, they if they wanted to lie about it, they would never make women the chief witnesses to the empty tomb. I think he rejects the methodology used by scholars called the criterion of embarrassment or principle of embarrassment. But they don't really, Jonathan and him don't really get into this debate. Mike Winger and Matt Dillahunty does get into it in their debate. All right, you don't need to find an empty tomb to have evidence for it, obviously. We have sources that are not anonymous that talk about it. So this is, Paul's book saying anonymous. Okay, what about the differences in the Gospels? This is a red herring again, completely irrelevant. The resurrection proclamation is much earlier than the Gospels. The fact that there's differences in the Gospels are, proof to Jesus didn't rise again from the dead, and it's not evidence against the resurrection proclamation, which is much earlier than the Gospels. Plus, the differences aren't irreconcilable, as he argues. The vast majority of them can be reconciled very easily. Most of them are usually complementary details that just add additional information, like the number of women at the tomb and that sort of thing. It just adds additional information to it. And of course, we have an account of Jesus' death and resurrection, I already mentioned. And we do have specific sermons on the resurrection in Acts. They're called by scholars as sermon summaries, and we have those. And they represent the earliest sermons of the apostles. And he says that it's absurd for, to think that people went feeding about 1,000 and nobody brought any food. And he just kind of misunderstands the text. He takes it out of context. This is a common theme of many skeptics. But the text actually says that they were in a remote area. Remote area. That's literally what it says. What does that mean? It means basically they were out. Today we'd probably say that they were out in the sticks or the boondocks or, somewhere out, outside of city limits. It's not like they could have gone to the local supermarket or something and get something to eat. In fact, the disciples were telling Jesus, hey, let's send them back to the village so they can get something to eat. So obviously they would be out in a position where they would not have that food. So it's not absurd. It's just because Matt is taking the passage out of context and trying to make it sound absurd when it's really not. All right, let's continue.
There could be the best evidence possible. And what we have is an absolute dearth of good evidence and people doing their best to say, you know what? I find these stories convincing and compelling, and so I'm going to make the case that they are. I don't find them convincing and compelling. And this could easily be fixed by an actual presentation of really good, strong evidence of this. And instead, all we end up getting, because all we have is people pointing to the Bible, these anonymous, unsourced accounts that we cannot investigate. I don't know how anybody consider it strong evidence. I can understand how somebody could say that, well, even if it's not strong evidence, it's enough to convince me. That's fine. That comes down to how flawed your epistemology is, how likely you are to believe things on not particularly good evidence.
All right. All right. He says that, of course, again, we have strong evidence in the form of the testimony of the disciples. And of course, Matt rejects that as evidence. That's the problem. This is going to come out during the Q&A. And it'll probably come out a little bit more better with more clarity in the third installment of this series that I'm doing. But obviously that's what's going on here. But that's just not the case. We do have evidence. We do have strong evidence. Of course, again, Matt is treating the Bible as if it's one source. It's not one source. It is several sources. And again, what's he mean by unsourced? I don't know. Maybe he means there's no external evidence, but that's not the case. We have lots of external evidence in favor of the Bible and agreeing with its historicity. I was talking to a guy the other day about the historical Jesus because he's an atheist and he denies that Jesus even exists. And he made the statement that the statement was it's proven factually inaccurate a long time ago. But he says that it's something that is proposed a lot by atheists on the internet. It isn't really proposed by scholarly atheists because they know better. Because they know as soon as you say that, we're going to point out sources that show that Jesus existed. And even then, almost all scholars agree that Jesus does exist. So there's only a few, radical scholars like Richard Carrier who denies that. But even Richard Carrier don't go as far as saying, well, there's no evidence outside the Bible for Jesus' existence. But a lot of atheists on the internet does that. They'll say, there's no evidence except the Bible for Jesus' existence. Well, we do. We have 39 sources. 17 of them are non-Christian, outside of the Bible for Jesus' existence. Most of them are extremely early, going back to 1st century or to very early 2nd century. So you're talking about really early sources. And and keep in mind, though, that the New Testament actually counts as evidence. I already mentioned that 27 books of the New Testament independently written and circulated during 1st century. So combine the 27 books with the 39 sources. So you got 27 sources plus 39 sources. That's 66 sources. We don't have that much evidence for any other person in history. And how does Matt know that the Bible is allegedly anonymous if we can't investigate it? This is a self-refuting argument. It's like me saying there's no way for us to know whether or not if Brian, does a video on resurrection or something of that nature, and I say there's no way to investigate it. How do you know that it might? If there's no way to investigate it. If there is if you know something, one way or the other, if you know something, if you know that the Gospels are anonymous, or if you know that they weren't written by the disciples, or if you know this or not, then you have a way of investigating it. To sit there say you have no way to investigate it, but then argue you know that the disciples didn't write it, even if that was the case, is self-refuting. Because obviously you do have a way of investigating. So it's a self-refuting argument. What about our epistemology is not flawed? Most Christians today take strong evidence. There are some that probably take very weak evidence, but most will take strong evidence. Most require strong evidence. I require strong evidence for my belief. I think Jonathan said that at the beginning of his opening case, he's a stock evidentialist, meaning that he is strictly evidence. I'm a cumulative case Christian apologist myself, but my mind is very evidence-based. I'm very evidence-based. So I want evidence. I want good evidence. The problem is he's assuming that testimony don't count as good evidence. The issue is more to do with Matt's epistemology than ours, because his epistemology is set up so that no matter what, the resurrection can't beat his standards, because he sets his epistemology up that way. It's set up immediately so the resurrection Christianity could fail no matter what, no matter how much evidence you have, no matter how good the evidence is. It's automatically failed because in his mind he doesn't think it's good enough evidence. But the fact that Matt Dillahunty is not convinced of it doesn't make it not the case. All right. I'm going to click it back over to my closing argument, and then I'll make a closing argument on this debate. Thank you. This is the we reached the end of our second part of the debate review to the debate between Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. And of course, we will be getting a part 3 that will have the crossbar section if I don't decide to split that up into 2 parts itself. Depends on how long it is. What do I think so far of this debate? I mean, what do you think? Tell me in the comments what you think so far of this debate. My assessment is never really good with Matt Dillahunty. I think he has a flawed epistemology. I think he sets the standard so high that virtually nothing could even pass it. He can't even tell you what would convince him. He tries to psychoanalyze God. He never presents any evidence himself. He often presents bogus analogies. He does this a lot during the crossfire section, where he assumes his conclusion. And, you know, I just don't get the feeling from him like he is trying to, that he is trying to know the truth. That he's trying to be convinced by the truth. It's like he has a presupposition, and that presupposition rules his thinking rather than the evidence. And I just don't get that. And so far, he has not said anything in this debate that's convinced him of his arguments or his position. Nothing he said in this debate is something to make me more skeptical than he is. You know, I just don't think that so far. I know it's still too early in the debate to be making assessments, and I'll just kind of leave it at that because I don't want to make my closing remarks. I've seen this debate hundreds of times. I've already got my conclusion, but it isn't because I didn't watch the debate. I watched this debate hundreds of times. Like I said, I've already done an entire debate review where I've already made the conclusion. But in this particular debate review of this debate, I'm not going to make my conclusion at this time of the overall debate. But so far, there's nothing Matt has said that's convinced me of his position or somehow disrupt the evidence. But I hope you understand something that does come out across this debate. It comes out quite often throughout the course of this debate. Matt has a tendency to dismiss the evidence without rhyme or reason. He doesn't have any real reason to dismiss the evidence, but he just does. Oh, there's just no evidence. Either he'll argue there's no evidence for the resurrection, or he'll argue that the evidence is weak. And the evidence is very strong. But a lot of he even denies historical methodologies and stuff. That doesn't come out as much in this debate as it did between Matt Dillahunty and Mike Winger, where he denies, and Mike Licona as well in his debate with Matt Dillahunty, where Matt seems to be denying historical methodologies. But, you know, it does come out. Because ultimately he does deny historical methodology. And I think he does show his hand on that too in this. I don't think it's clear in this section of the debate review, but it will be clear in the other parts of this debate review. I hope you're enjoying this debate review. I really am. I enjoyed making this debate review. I enjoyed watching the debate. I think it was very cool of James Coons to give me permission, the freedom to do this debate review, as well as open the door for me to do other debate reviews on his channel. I think that was pretty awesome. And I do appreciate that, and I give props to him for allowing me to do this. But anyway, please like and subscribe this video, and don't forget to hit the notification bell, because that's the way you get notified for all future videos. I post at least one video per week, sometimes multiple videos a week. I have a habit of doing multiple videos a week, so be expecting that, especially me doing the debate review series. I might end up posting, I think I already posted the first video only a few days ago, and now I'm posting the next. So yeah, expect that from my channel, because I post a lot of apologetic material. And I believe in this stuff. I believe wholeheartedly. I believe it needs to get out. I think it needs to be presented. I think the Christian faith needs to be defended. A lot of people just don't know. I mean, like my slogan often says, I mean, you have to learn the facts that the critics don't want you to know, because critics, they're going to tell you either not the whole story, or they're going to tell you a distorted version of it. They're going to tell you their side of the story. But it really comes down to knowing all of the facts and knowing the evidence. For example, when Matt said in this particular section of the debate, where he says that no manuscript, all the copies that we have are anonymous. He might have meant within the text itself, not necessarily the title, but the titles of the manuscript. All the ones that have complete enough copies where we can assess one way or the other, all have their titles on them. That doesn't mean the originals did. We don't know if the originals did. But it does mean that the claim that all of our copies are anonymous, meaning that the title is not in there, that's not even true. That's just not true. But Matt asserted it, didn't he? In any case, like and subscribe. And also, keep in mind, always be ready to learn the facts the critics don't want you to know. Thank you for watching my video.